This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. What is the value of a human life? Well, that answer lies beyond the ken of priests, philosophers, or physicians. The quality adjusted life year, or QALY standard for valuing life, is at the core of many European healthcare rationing policies. Initially adopted to reduce costs for prohibitively high-priced therapies, many European healthcare services use QALY to authorize therapies based on their demonstrated ability to extend the length and quality of life relative to their costs. In the US, QALY's seemingly objective and scientific model is gaining purchase with policymakers looking to reduce future costs for federally funded programs such as Medicaid and Medicare. Could US healthcare costs be contained if experts were able to weigh a therapy's medical benefits against its costs of use? Could those experts be expected to compare drugs that extended lives with those that merely improved life quality? And if greater quality and quantity of life determines a therapy's value, will therapies that aid older or weaker patients be funded less or lose approval? And would Americans accept a denial of treatment based on an expert's view of its relative value? My guest today is Dr. Bill Smith, Senior Fellow in Life Sciences at Pioneer Institute and author of the recently released book entitled Rationing Medicine: Threats from European Cost-Effectiveness Models to American Seniors and Other Vulnerable Populations, in which he examines the ethical and medical foundations for using quality-adjusted life year methods to ration medical therapies. Dr. Smith will discuss his book's argument that while methodologies purport to offer objective and fair valuations for medical therapies, the complexity and subjectivity of quality metrics make their real-world application clinically meaningless and politically untenable. He will share with us the ways in which quality standards could stifle innovation and limit access to treatment for the elderly and vulnerable. When I return, I'll be joined by Pioneer Institute's Senior Fellow and author, Dr. Bill Smith. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by our listener favorite and author of the newly released book, Rationing Medicine: Threats from European Cost-Effectiveness Models to Seniors and Other Vulnerable Populations, Dr. Bill Smith. Welcome back to Hubwonk, Bill.
Great to be with you, Joe.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you. Congratulations on the release of your new book. I've read it, and it's really interesting. It covers some of the topics you and I have discussed in earlier episodes of Hubwonk, but some new material, even some that includes the experiences of what we've learned from the experience of COVID. So let's start with the idea that you've chosen to examine the way in which European models ration medicine. I think more specifically, it's Great Britain that you cite most often. But before we get kicked off, let's talk about why, let's say, Great Britain's system is different, how it's different, and why these systems might have been embraced by the UK, whereas no such rationing methodologies are used in the US, to date. So let's start there.
Yeah, so this is really telling the story of how the quality adjusted life year developed is really kind of interesting, because it gives you insight into why they use these systems in particularly in countries that have socialized medicines. And in Great Britain, what happened was in the 60s and 70s, this idea was kicking around in the universities to develop some type of cost effectiveness methodology to rate surgeries and drugs and anything in healthcare. But it got new life in the 90s. There was a health minister named Jerry Malone in 1995. And MS patients, multiple sclerosis patients, started in the 1990s taking beta interferon, which was a very expensive medication, but seemed to have some efficacy on MS. And the National Health Service had to decide whether to cover it, and it was going to be very expensive. Some estimates ran as even high as 10% of the entire National Health Service budget would have to be devoted to beta interferon if they covered it for everyone. And so they brought this to the health minister to decide. And he was really angry that they had brought him this very difficult decisions, because he was caught between his budget concerns and the patients. And he ended up splitting the baby and covering it for some people and not others. But he said to his staff, I'm done with making these decisions. I don't want to be stuck with deciding that the life or death of a patient. Develop some kind of system that will be objective and will be seen as objective. And so by 1997, a couple of years later, Tony Blair had come in on a commitment to save the National Health Service, and they instituted the formal cost effectiveness methodology called the Quality Adjusted Life Year.
So I want to stop there. So at its heart, it was sort of a cost control methodology. You can't give it to everyone, as you say, it would bankrupt the system. But on another level, it was an objective to deflect blame from, let's say, political leaders and say, look, I don't want to be the minister of life and death. I'd rather have some sort of quote unquote objective standard so that I can shift, I don't call it blame, but responsibility for these decisions.
Absolutely.
To some formula.
The cynic would say it was a fig leaf to provide political cover on tough healthcare decisions that had to be made when the government runs the entire healthcare system. Yeah,
so you can see why it would have some purchase amongst those who want to control costs and also deflect blame. But fundamentally, Bill, before we get further down this line, for our listeners, you and I have talked about this idea in the past. In a system like in the UK, the government is running the healthcare system, as opposed to in the US, it's a private system that the government helps subsidize. In other words, they may give you a check to go into your private hospital and get a private doctor to give you, medicine provided by the private sector. In the UK, the government's running the show. So in our system, when the patient walks through the front door, they're a revenue opportunity. The hospital wants to charge you for the service they provide. In the UK, when you walk in the front door, you're a cost center, meaning every person that walks through the door is one less dollar the NHS has for someone else. So it's a very different universe.
Absolutely correct. And in the US, there are also more market forces that help keep quality high. If you're on your company's health plan, that health plan obviously has a goal of controlling costs, but the health plan also has the goal of pleasing the employer, pleasing the employees. So there are market forces in place in particularly in the commercial health plan insurance world in the US that are incentives to keep quality high. And I can't say those same incentives exist in Canada or Great Britain, where the government controls everything.
Yes, indeed. So let's get into this. It's a quality adjusted life years. What we're trying to do, or what the UK was trying to do, and what we're going to be talking about today, is a sort of a methodology to say, okay, some medicines are worth the price and others are not. Explain for our listeners, what does that mean when we're talking about how does one have an index whereby this drug that solves this disease for this patient versus that different disease, a different patient? How do we get every disease and every patient into one index? Where are we coming from?
So the quality adjusted life year is a methodology that tries to measure the ability of a drug to extend life. How long is it going to keep you alive, and improve the quality of life? And they use a score of 1.0. So let's just say a new cancer drug extends life for 6 months. It would get a 0.5 rating on longevity scale. But let's say it also causes pain when you're taking the drug. So it only gets a 0.3 on that scale, on the quality of life scale. So the average ends up being a 0.4, and that drug gets a 0.4 score. And then the value of human life, and this is the arbitrary nature of the quality, they put a monetary value on a year of life lived in perfect health, a good quality of life, and a year of full life. And in the US, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, which does a lot of the quality reviews in the US, rates the value of a life between $100,000 and $150,000. So if a drug got a 0.4 score, it might be cost effective if it was less than $40,000, because you multiply 0.4 times $100,000 or $150,000, and you get a range of when the drug would be cost effective. That's crudely how it works. I mean, there are more complex calculations that go into establishing these qualities, but basically they put a value on human life. And the thing about that is it's completely subjective, because if you were to say, which I would say about my children, that their lives are worth tens of millions of dollars, then any drug is going to be rated as cost effective. If you say a human life is only worth $10,000, many, many, many drugs will not be rated as cost effective. So you can manipulate this value of human life threshold up and down, and governments do manipulate it up and down to decide how much they're going to spend on drugs and how many drugs are going to be declared not cost effective. And so the UK even has a lower threshold than the US. The 100 to $150,000 threshold used by ICER is even lower. It's 30,000 or 40,000 pounds in Great Britain. So many, many drugs are not rated as cost effective in Britain. But the entire, in my view, the entire system is arbitrary because of that designation of valuing life at a certain level. And if you can manipulate that up and down, you can decide which drugs are going to be cost effective and which are not.
So let's table that idea, and let's stipulate that one has the wisdom of Solomon to know how much a life is truly worth in an objective sense. Your book goes into great detail and talk about there are other flaws with, even if we could determine what a single life is worth, there are difficult challenges in comparing saving the life of, let's say, a child versus an older person. That the system, deliberately waits a year of life, and if one is 10 years old and we save their life and they're expected to live to 80, that's 70 years of benefit. Whereas if one is 70 and you address their disease and cure their disease and provide them with 10 additional years, you're really, you're saying that the child's cure is 7 times more valuable than the adult or older person's cure. That seems to be, even if you are able to objectively value a life, a deep problem, meaning it's fundamentally ageist. It would almost discount or disregard any disease that afflicts the elderly. Do I have that right?
Yes, and the same is true of quality of life for those people living with disabilities. They may never get a perfect quality of life. So if a drug extends their life dramatically, but does not improve their quality of life significantly, that drug is by nature going to get a lower score under the quality, because it won't get a high quality of life score. So drugs that extend the lives of people living with disabilities are not going to be rated as highly. So it's got all sorts of, what my book tries to do is look at different patient populations and the complexities involved in those patient populations, patients living with rare diseases or cancer or with disabilities, and say, you know what, this quality model can't capture the complexities of this, and it ends up being unfair to these specific populations, because I'm skeptical that you could come up with some formula invented, with the guy with a calculator that can capture all the possible complexities of a drug therapy on a patient.
So right now we don't have this sort of quality standard, but your book mentions the fact that even if we were to have this, we do have other protections for those with disabilities, specifically the ADA. And if literally by statute, such a standard would discount all diseases. If we're in a wheelchair and our quality of life is half that of those people who are, not confined to a wheelchair, every therapy that serves us is half as valuable as every therapy that serves someone without such a disability. So we're by definition discriminating against those with disabilities. Do you think that sort of right out of the gate any sort of quality would fail on that measure?
As a practical matter, I think if Congress were to pass legislation, and they're actually moving in the opposite direction, they're thinking about banning the quality. But if they were somehow to pass legislation implementing the quality system to rate drugs in Medicare and Medicaid, I think it would immediately draw an Americans with Disabilities Act lawsuit, and that lawsuit would be successful.
Yes, indeed. Now, your book, again, we're going to talk about all the flaws with quality, and I was take each one by one. How does, if again, we're going to stipulate that it's well-intentioned, but how does a quality, again, we're using European models as our example, how does a quality capture the real world experience of patients with particular therapies? Meaning, I'm suffering from condition A, you're suffering from condition B. Who's there to objectively measure how much if we've improved? It seems impossible.
Yeah, it is difficult, and there are flaws in the quality system. If, for example, on quality of life measures, you're trying to give a drug a score on a quality of life measure, and let's say it causes pain or it forces you into a wheelchair. There's all sorts of things that quality of life conditions that could be scored under the quality. And what they do is they sample the general population. They don't sample the patients who actually suffer from that condition. They go out to the general public and say, how valuable would it be if it reduced your pain level from a 10 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10? How valuable would that be? And then they give it a score, and they kind of poll the general population. And I think one of the terrible flaws in the quality methodology is they don't actually poll patients that are suffering from these conditions, who would know exactly what changes in quality of life would matter and how to score them.
Yeah, indeed. Now we're talking in general terms about what kind of conditions. Let's drill down to some of the more specific, real world problems that people are likely to encounter. You talk in some depth about cancer, which ranks just behind heart disease for a killer of Americans in the U.S. Just the very word cancer, I'm sure, strikes fear in everyone's heart because it can hit anyone at any time. Why would, let's say, quality be very, very difficult, particularly with cancer in targeting therapies that most benefit cancer patients?
Well, there are numerous reasons I point to. For example, they don't put any value on the caregivers and how a drug might improve the life of a caregiver, because caregivers spend on average 33 hours a week in caring for a patient with cancer. If you have a spouse or a child, God forbid, gets cancer, you spend a lot of time, and they don't rate the value of all that caregiving. But more scientifically, even more economically, cancer clinical trials generally do not reflect how the drug is later used. So a drug may be in a clinical trial for prostate cancer, and then oncologists later discover, hey, this is really effective on small cell lung cancer. So it becomes a small cell lung cancer drug. The problem with that is that the quality review takes place using the clinical trial data. So they're reviewing a drug that's not even going to be used by this set of patients. And it's typically not enough patients for them to make a reliable review. So because you don't know how long a drug is going to keep a cancer patient alive just in the trials, you got to find out how many people are going to survive. But they don't wait. They do the reviews generally right away using only clinical trial data.
So,
and later, the patient could live for 50 more years, and it could be a miracle cure, and that won't show up in the clinical trial.
So this seems to be a huge flaw in that determining the quality is a moment in time, looking backward and saying it has done these things, so therefore it is worth X.
Right.
What you're suggesting is it may do far more, but that's unknowable at the time you make the determination, so that once a quality is established, despite the subsequent benefits, as you say, 50 more years of additional life that might have influence, but of course is unknowable at the time, further distorts these values.
Precisely. And the same is true with rare diseases. Gene therapies, one of the big unknowables about gene therapies is how long will it last? If you can replace a flawed gene, cut it out using CRISPR technology, replace it with a healthy gene, how long does that gene stay healthy? And the answer is we just don't know. We don't know. And the people doing quality reviews can't know one way or the other. So I just consider them unreliable.
Your book, again, to bring in the British model, talks about the way in which not only is it, let's say, unscientific and somewhat arbitrary, it's politically, let's say, unpalatable. Your book mentions the way in which the British system tried to use quality for cancer therapies, and there was somewhat of a backlash. Describe for our listeners how that evolved.
Yeah. So when the drug Herceptin was approved, in the US in particular, it was thought of as a miracle drug treatment for breast cancer. And the EU was slow in approving different indications for the drug. And it was not approved for early stage breast cancer. It was only approved for later stages. And yet British women wanted the treatment. If you're diagnosed with early stage breast cancer, you read about this miracle drug, Herceptin, and it wasn't available. It wasn't available. And the National Health Service was taking a long time to do the quality review because they wanted to study how long it would keep patients alive. And there were all these bureaucratic challenges in getting it to patients in Britain. But patients revolted. They just descended upon the parliament. And in the midst of this Herceptin controversy, a study appeared that was commissioned by the parliament, which said the British people have the worst cancer care in the developed world, and that they would have to spend 200 million pounds per year to catch up with the rest of the world on cancer care. So the parliament just said, forget it. We're not doing any more quality reviews on oncology drugs. We're just going to appropriate 200 million pounds and we're going to pay for all the latest treatments. And it's called the Drugs Cancer Fund, and it still exists. And it was a reaction to the quality actually scaling back the number of treatments that were available to men and women in Great Britain. And politically, there was such a backlash, they just threw the quality out, right out the window.
So were we even to consider implementing it, it's likely that, once people are faced with these constraints, political will break the quality standard more than likely. But I want to move on. One thing occurred to me while you were answering: were we to embrace this sort of constraint on, were we to use quality to determine which drugs are "quote unquote" valuable enough to cover? Wouldn't this perhaps be a convenient way for other, let's say, actors in our health system, like PBMs and insurance companies, if they wanted to, let's say, improve their bottom line and simply ensure that quality's disqualified all these rather expensive new drugs? Wouldn't it, wouldn't they benefit as well? Essentially saying, yeah, cover the low cost drugs, but don't cover these high cost drugs. It seems like a simple out.
Yeah. I tend to worry more about the use of the quality in rationing medicines in the government programs and not as much in the commercial world. As I talked about earlier, there are market incentives in the commercial world for health insurance companies to cover drugs, to have a robust formulary, and to be able to say to the employer, whether it's Ford Motor Company or JP Morgan or whoever, you know what, we're giving you a quality formulary. Your employees are going to be quite happy with it. So, there are incentives, of course, to cut costs, but there are also incentives to keep quality. And so I would worry most about the use of the quality. I think commercial health medical directors, commercial health insurance medical directors, for example, will probably read a review about the quality and try to understand what they're saying, but won't use it exclusively in making a decision about a formulary on a drug. Whereas I think the danger is if it were adopted by the government, Medicaid, or some other program, they would just take the recommendation and implement it.
So all the horror stories and all the prospects, the dystopian future is really going to fall, unfortunately, to those who are most vulnerable. Let's say the poor or the old, who are relying on government.
Yeah, but getting back to your earlier point about political backlash, I do not see American senior citizens putting up with this kind of rationing in their Part D program, for example. I just don't see it. There would be an enormous backlash if the Medicare program, by using the quality, started scaling back oncology drugs or cardiovascular drugs or other drugs that seniors really relied upon.
Well, that dovetails into I won't call it a final point, but a feature in your book that I think is very valuable. When they talk about qualities, we're talking about, as you say, improving quality of life and years of life, but of course within populations. That is, if everybody gets a particular disease, it's a very valuable prospect to have some sort of cure. If only a few people get a particular disease, again, it's discounted. So these so-called orphan drugs, or those drugs that afflict a smaller proportion of our society, are naturally at a disadvantage, both as far as quality score, but also as far as political will goes, to sort of tie all those ideas together. If I've got a disease that very few people have, the quality score may be lower because the entire population doesn't necessarily need it. And also the political will behind defending those drugs is smaller. Wouldn't this system make orphan drugs, particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, and in my view, the quality, the threshold for life, the value of life for the quality does not take into account the unique market forces that go into creating a rare disease drug. Rare disease drugs are very expensive to develop because it's hard to find the patients with the disease. You might find one patient in Idaho that has the particular rare disease. And guess what? You have to set up a clinical trial site for that one patient. You have to ship nurses and all sorts of people up there to take that person's blood on a regular basis. And that's very expensive to do. So while the R&D is expensive, then when it comes time and the drug is approved, you have a small set of patients to sell it to, right? You have 1,000, 2,000 patients. So by their nature, rare disease drugs are going to be more expensive. Now, we can argue in individual cases whether 3 million is too expensive or 1 million is too expensive. But as a general law of economics, rare disease drugs are going to be more expensive than other drugs. But the quality methodology doesn't take that into account. And they keep the thresholds the same, whether it's for rare disease drugs or for non-rare disease drugs. And I just don't see how that's sustainable, particularly as we move, as the human genome gets mapped further and further, and we start to understand that particular sets of patients, drugs are going to be very effective, and for other sets of patients, they're going to be ineffective.
Well, I think you've nicely set up my last question specifically about smaller patient groups. We focus often on HubWonk on the concept of precision medicine, whereby rather than giving everybody a therapy and seeing who it works on, in the future, not too distant future, we'll be able to use gene therapy to understand which drugs are right for which patients, in which case each of us is essentially an orphan drug or rare disease holder. My cancer is different than your cancer, therefore my therapy is different than your therapy. Therefore, as they become more and more targeted, the quality score sort of disappears because I'm a subset of one rather than 600 million people who get cancer every year. So describe for us then how precision medicine and quality are sort of
I think precision medicine makes the quality eventually obsolete.
Right.
They don't test drugs for lung cancer anymore, for example. They test drugs for different types of genetic flaws that lead to lung cancer. And so getting a large sample of patients and coming up with one score for a lung cancer drug, I think that world is going to go away. I don't see how we keep it going. One patient may see the drug be highly effective and improve their quality of life dramatically, and the next patient, it will do nothing for them. So I just don't know how these large scale cost effectiveness studies can stick around in a world of personalized medicine.
So for many reasons that we've covered here and your book covers, and I hope our listeners will go out and buy that book. It's an excellent book, very, very dense and concise. But
I have it right here, Rationing Medicine.
All right, good.
And it's available on Amazon and Kindle version also.
All right, we move product on this podcast, so I hope everyone will run out and buy it. But how real? I mean, we've painted we're in violent agreement that these standards, these quote unquote rational, objective rationing standards, are by their very nature vague, arbitrary, and obsolete if we accept the notion that we're moving towards precision medicine. Where are they now? Who is proposing this? Are we just inventing monsters to dragons to slay, or is someone actually proposing using these kind of standards to ration medicine in the United States?
Well, that's a complicated question. That when the House Republicans took the House in the last midterm election, the new chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Kathy McMorris Rogers, actually has a son living with disabilities and has passed a bill both at the subcommittee and full committee level that would ban the use of the QALY. Now, the Democrats were nervous about this bill because they felt the language might be too sweeping and might prevent Joe Biden's administration from putting price controls on drugs that were passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. How are they going to decide what price the drug is going to be? And if they ban the use of all cost effectiveness methodologies, will the Biden administration have the ability to put those price controls on? So there's a lot kicking around in the Beltway about cost effectiveness reviews and how to implement them. Generally, the Republicans are opposed to the quality overall because they see it as a tool of rationing medicine, like in socialist countries. And the Democrats are also, to their credit, they're very concerned about the impact on people living with disabilities of the quality. So you have some very articulate Democrats like Tony Coelho, the former House whip, who has epilepsy and has been a very articulate advocate opposing the quality. So there's a good deal of opposition in the U.S. to the quality, but there's also concern that they want to ratchet down pharmaceutical prices, and that's a common theme of most politicians.
Indeed, it's interesting. Then we have this is a rare event whereby Congress is actually asserting its power over the executive branch to say, these are you have a broad sweeping power to pursue healthcare policies, but we're going to constrain your prerogatives by forbidding the use of these kinds of standards. And as you say, it has, perhaps for slightly different reasons, broad bipartisan support. So that were Biden to try something like this, it may get sort of either invalidated or slapped down by Congress.
I mean, the Biden administration, again, to their credit, has said in various reports and other documents, we are not going to use the quality when we're reviewing drugs in Medicare. But they want to retain the ability to use potentially some other cost effectiveness methodology, which is unsaid. They haven't explained how they're going to do that.
Well, that's a good way to, we're getting close to the end of our time together. Look, you and I both are advocates of markets and their ability to control costs. You mentioned the fact that we have more market forces here in the US than we might have in, let's say, countries where the government actually provides healthcare. You and I also share concerns that our budgets for healthcare and everything really are exploding. If not for quality or something like that to ration which therapies are cost effective and which are just absolutely, not. What would you, as an expert, as a PhD in this universe, someone who's written a book, if not quality, how do we ration medicine and the cost of medicine in a meaningful way that brings value to everyone?
Well, we do it now. I mean, we do it now. It's just not a formula that somebody with a slide rule somewhere has invented that tries to capture all the complexity. Let's face it, the value of a drug is going to be determined by the payers, by the physicians, by the patients' caregivers, by a whole web of social actors that are going to have views about how valuable that particular drug is. And I'm skeptical that some really smart economist from Harvard could come up with a formula that would capture all of that complexity and all of those inputs that go into assessing value. I'd rather leave it to the market the way it is and let payers and patients, and if a drug is highly effective and the patient really is thrilled with taking it, their employer's going to know, and then the employer's going to tell the health plan, and the health plan's going to want to cover it, and you'll have forces that are healthy forces in place, rather than with somebody coming up with some complex formula done on high in an academic way and them playing God and saying, okay, this drug is not cost effective.
So go ahead. I was going to say this is sort of the classic Hayekian knowledge problem that nobody could possibly assess the value of a particular drug or therapy. It's unknowable.
Yeah, that's it. A million market forces have to come in and decide. A few years ago, 2018, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway, and Amazon all got together and said, we're going to remake healthcare. And they hired some Harvard surgeon who said, I'm going to remake healthcare. All the incentives are wrong. The system is broken. We're going to have a completely revolution in healthcare in these three companies. The thing failed because I don't think you can do top-down figuring out of all the forces that matter in healthcare. I just think that you got to get input from a lot of people, from patients, from their physicians, but ultimately let the market sort it out.
And ultimately, the byproduct of this market sorting it out is a lot of money does go into these therapies, but that is also a healthy incentive for innovation. So, all the things that you might get treated with didn't exist 10 years ago. And those are people chasing the opportunity of innovation and perhaps profit. And then I'll bring in one final issue that you and I have talked about on other podcast episodes. All these therapies, as expensive as they are, ultimately fall off patent and become virtually free for everyone. Meaning, if you're on the bleeding edge of a new therapy, sure, it costs a lot, but only for a short period of time. Then it goes to nothing, which is to say it's the sort of the exhaust of a, let's say, costly system that, is always clawing for the next better thing. Once you shut that off with, let's say, a quality methodology, the conveyor belt of new innovation stops. You essentially have access to everything and everything that exists, and nothing to those things that do not yet exist.
And even for drugs that remain on patent and remain expensive, that might be more than $1 million, the market is responding. I mean, Harvard Pilgrim, which is a health plan up in Boston, is one of the leaders in so-called value-based reimbursement. And basically what that means is they pay for a drug in installments. So you have a $2 million drug that cures a terrible disease, and you only have a couple patients with it. You say to the health plan says to the drug manufacturer, okay, we'll pay $500,000 up front, and then we'll pay a series of $500,000 payments. But if the drug stops working, we stop paying. So, there are creative things that can be done to pay for these more expensive rare disease drugs, and the market's figuring those out.
So again, we're preaching a market methodologies, but lots of different consumers, lots of different providers, each with their own perception of value, are providing, a sort of a machine for determining value, keeping costs under control, but still incentivizing new innovation. Is there anywhere? So again, I want to give you one final chance to plug the book, but where for our listeners who want to understand everything there is to know about quality beyond reading your book, are there, let's say, inspirational thinkers or political leaders that really get it and are vigilant about these kinds of bizarre or arbitrary rationing methodologies?
Well, for fairness sake, they should go on the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review's website. They're the foremost advocates in the U.S. of using the QALY, and they explain their methodology, and they have a very useful website that goes through their methodology and how it works. And they're constantly making revisions, trying to adjust the methodology for this or that circumstance which has arisen. So, as far as equal time, I might point them there first. They certainly can read my book. They could follow the hearings that have happened in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, both the Subcommittee on Health and the full committee, where they talked about the QALY in great detail. The Biden administration, Secretary Becerra has put out a report about cost effectiveness methodologies in Medicare, the one where they acknowledged they weren't going to use the QALY. So there are lots of resources around there. It appears to be a very complicated topic, but once you scratch the surface of it, you realize what's going on. They're just assessing a value to human life, and they can manipulate that value up or down depending on how many drugs they want to pay for. And that's how it works.
Indeed. Getting back to full circle, once you're a cost center, which you are, let's say, in a government program, it's up to them to value your life.
Exactly.
Good luck with that. We'll see how history has treated those people who've trusted the government to value their life. So to see the opposite, let's say the counterpart to our discussion, they would go to the ICER, or the Institute for Clinical Economic Review.
Correct.
And read the best case for preserving a QALY or a quote unquote rational rationing methodology. So, Bill, this has been a great conversation. Again, the name of your book and where they can buy it.
It's Rationing Medicine, William Smith, and Threats from European Cost Effectiveness Models to America's Seniors and Other Vulnerable Populations. It's just a small paperback. It's $9.95. You can get it on Amazon, and the Kindle may even be free. I can't remember. But it's readily available on Amazon.
I think that's it's a great. I love the title because I think threats to seniors and other vulnerable populations. I will count the rest of us is either future seniors or future vulnerable populations. So
we're going to fall into one of those categories one day.
So this has universal value. So thank you very much for joining me again today on Hubwonk. Good luck with the new book.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
This has been another episode of Hubwonk. If you enjoyed today's show, there are several ways to support Hubwonk and Pioneer Institute. It would be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to Hubwonk on your iTunes podcatcher. It would make it easier for others to find Hubwonk if you offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. We're always grateful if you share Hubwonk with friends. If you have ideas or comments or suggestions for me about future Hubwonk episode topics, you're welcome to email me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of Hubwonk.